Hello once again, everybody. I'm your host, Johnathon Robson, and this is the C-Bus Paranormal Paracast. On the next two episodes, I'm going to be discussing a location that I know extremely well, Prospect Place Mansion in Trinway, Ohio. As most of you know, I was one of the owners of this location from 2017 to 2022, and our team has investigated the property numerous times over the years. There have been several ghost hunting television shows, books, and magazines that have featured Prospect Place over the years. And in nearly every case, there was some sort of misinformation aired or printed. Unfortunately, the television shows, fellow ghost hunters, thrill seekers, and other forms of media didn't bother to do proper research on this property. And this has led to numerous individuals repeating outright lies and misinformation for decades. I encourage all of you to share these next two episodes with the paranormal community and your friends. This is the only way for us to combat misinformation and to spread the truth and proper research. On the next two episodes, I will be calling out the lies, legends, and prior misinformation that has previously plagued this location. To put it bluntly, nobody is going to be spared during the next two episodes. This includes prior local newspaper coverage, misinformation shared by ghost hunters, and misinformation aired on television in the name of entertainment. I will be sharing nearly 3 years of painstaking research that required me to pull newspaper articles, prison records, property records, and even cemetery records in the search for the truth. While the story of Prospect Place Mansion has been rather diluted over the years, I am proud to have been one of the people to help turn this property around. I honestly don't think the paranormal community realizes how close it was to permanently losing this location a few years back. However, it has thankfully reemerged from the ashes with a new board of trustees and tireless hours of dedication from the building's staff and volunteers. I do think it is important that we recognize these folks that have spent a considerable amount of their own time to work on the mansion, open the doors for tours, and help plan their various special events over the last few years. While I have retired from my position on the board, I do wish all of these individuals nothing but success, and I will be more than happy to still help and volunteer when I'm able to down at the mansion. That being said, I do want to give a shout out to our latest Patreon supporter, and my co-author, Jeff Cole from Ghostly Encounters, Confessions of a Paranormal Investigator. Jeff has been a great friend of mine for several years now, and he is still currently working as a member of the Board of Trustees at the mansion. Unfortunately, he did abandon us Ohio folks a few years back, but I do still get to see him a couple times a year when it's possible. Hopefully, once we get the team rolling again, we can team up for another round of investigations or two in the near future. Mike and I truly appreciate the support. Thank you. Similar to our last location spotlight episode, I will be sharing several pieces of research this month related to our topic. So make sure to visit us on social media for photos, stories, newspaper clippings, and more. I do plan to start doing this with every episode going forward, and hopefully this will help make each episode a little bit more interactive for all of you. We will also keep sharing exclusive and early content for our Patreon subscribers as well. Unfortunately, we haven't been as active on the investigation front since Mike's surgery, but I have been working on some things during our downtime behind the scenes. I have upgraded my personal computer, as well as our audio and video software. So that should make for some interesting new content in the future, and hopefully a slightly new presentation once I get these new editors down. That being said, let's start digging into this episode and discuss the legends and facts of Prospect Place Mansion. For our new listeners, please remember to follow us on social media, visit cbusparanormal.com, and subscribe to the C-Bus Paranormal Paracast for the latest updates. We also have a Patreon page set up for additional content. We offer ad-free episodes, behind-the-scenes looks into our investigations, exclusive content, and we'll give shout-outs to new subscribers on future episodes of the Paracast. We're looking to expand the Patreon page as we go, and we're looking to make it even more interactive in the near future. A small monthly donation goes a long way in helping us provide new content for the show. For more information, visit patreon.com/cbusparanormal paracast. Prospect Place Mansion was the first location that C-Bus Paranormal actually investigated as a team. And I'll never forget driving up to the mansion for the first time in November of 2011. Our team had driven on State Route 666. Yeah, you can't make that up. For what seemed like an eternity until we finally found the mansion lurking on a hill on the outskirts of a small town. It was a rainy and cold day, and the sun was just starting to set. The weather had started to change, and the signs of winter were starting to appear. There were 3 of us on this investigation, and we really didn't know what to expect. We had recently watched the episodes of Prospect Place that appeared on Ghost Hunters and Ghost Adventures, and while we thought that the episodes appeared to be rather sensationalized, we were extremely invested in the building's claims of activity and history. These shows featured everything from the Underground Railroad, a massive train wreck, and even a supposed demonic presence on the property. Unfortunately, we didn't realize how sensationalized these shows actually were until a few years later. After we arrived, we'd be greeted by the then caretaker and supposed great-great-grandson of the original owner, Jeff, or George as he liked to be called, Adams. I remember our interactions as being brief as he disappeared shortly after we signed our investigation waivers. I was able to get a little bit of information out of him from some of the recent experiences other investigators had been having on the property, but for the most part we were left to our own devices for the night. The mansion itself was extremely large, and it was advertised to have 29 rooms. The caretaker at the time lived in a small apartment in the servants' side of the house, and we had free range to investigate nearly everywhere else on the property. We were also granted access to the barn outside, which had its own haunted legends and creep factor. This location was the absolute embodiment of what you'd expect a haunted house to look like. Our first investigation proved to be very active, and I think all of us came away with it with a newfound appreciation for the paranormal. We'd experienced several odd events that night, everything from EVPs, disembodied voices, and footsteps throughout our stay. I'll never forget the 3 of us being on the 2nd floor and hearing what we thought was our gear being messed with downstairs, in the room that we set our equipment up in. We all quickly moved downstairs and circled the entire 1st floor, and realized that nobody was down there with us. We then looked at each other in amazement as the sounds of footsteps started above us on the floors we were just on. This event would happen for about 2 minutes, and then it would stop. It was clear that we weren't alone, and something was possibly trying to interact with us. Our team would eventually make it a tradition to investigate the property at least once every year, and for the most part, the location rarely disappointed us. It always seemed like we would leave with some sort of evidence, and it quickly became one of our favorite locations to investigate. Eventually, I would become a volunteer of the property in 2015, and we started work on cleaning up the house and doing some preservation projects it desperately needed. During this time, Jeff Adams and the Board of Trustees had become embroiled in a property tax dispute that would eventually make its way to court. We would continue to help work on the property until 2017 when Adams announced that he was looking to retire from his position. The previous Board of Trustees were looking for replacements, as they were all stepping down from their positions. Unaware of what was about to transpire, a few of our volunteers, myself included, stepped into the vacant Board of Trustees spots and in turn became responsible for the property. At that time, we were advised by Adams that he would remain on the property for about a year to make sure that we could get used to our new positions. In short, he moved without warning less than 2 months later, and we received a final notice property tax bill the same week he moved out. We were all left stranded on a sinking ship with little to no training, and we were responsible for a mess that we didn't even create. To make matters worse, the mansion appeared to be ransacked on the way out. It was a mess, and there were nearly 70 cats on the premises, inside and outside of the house, that were abandoned. The mansion had already been booking overnights and tours for the year, and at this point we had no idea what the future would hold. We quickly got our lawyer on the line, and we were left with literally no choice but to get to work. After making several adjustments to our daily lives to make sure the mansion stayed in operation, we would enter into a settlement for the owed property tax. At this point, it would be easier for us to pay the $24,000 in back property tax than to continuously fight it in court or have the property seized. Unfortunately, it would also mean that the taxes would cut into our repair budget for the next 4 years. We had to find new and creative ways to make the mansion move forward, and at the same time clean up the mess that we inherited. During this process, one of our board members became an expert cat trapper. She caught and rehomed our numerous feline friends, and it seemed like I was down at the mansion nearly every week at one point doing something for the mansion, either doing cleanup, accounting, opening doors, or helping with investigations. During that time, I started noticing how inaccurate and inconsistent some of the stories investigators were telling as they came in to investigate, and my interest in finding the actual truth behind these legends would only grow from there. Eventually, I would get to work searching in newspaper archives to start fact-checking what had been stated about the mansion's history over the years. Little did I know, I was about to make several interesting discoveries. To understand my research, you're going to need to know the previously believed history of Prospect Place Mansion. While there is some truth to some of these stories, there is also a great deal of inaccuracy, legends, and unknowns as well. I'll be sharing my research and corrections for these events as we progress through the mansion's story. We're going to start our story off with George Beale Adams, a plantation owner from Virginia. The state of Ohio officially joined the Union and became a free state in 1803. During that time, the state ratified its constitution, and within the new documentation it was stated that the state was to forever be free from slavery and involuntary servitude. George Beale Adams, a plantation owner in Virginia, would take note of this, and he would eventually decide to move his family to Ohio in 1808. It's been stated that George Beale Adams believed that all men were created equal, and he is strongly against the concept of slavery that was still being practiced in the southern states. George Beale Adams would sell his family's estate and purchase military grant lands on the eastern side of the Muskingum River, near Dresden, Ohio. George Beale Adams died in 1826. His estate would be passed on to his sons George Willison Adams and Edward Adams. The Adams brothers would eventually get into the milling business, and they would start making a considerable fortune for themselves. The brothers were able to take advantage of the Ohio and Erie canals that had recently been built on the north side of their town, and they were able to use the canals to ship their products great distances. During this time, George and his brother would build two nearly identical houses in Preston Township, now known as Adams Mills, and they would start their own families. If you visit Adams Mills today, you can still see how the Adams brothers' operation was laid out. You can also still visibly see the canal lock in the area. Unfortunately, George Adams' home in Adams Mills has been lost to history, and his brother Edward's house caught fire a few years back under suspicious circumstances. However, you can still see the remnants of the house's fireplace and a barn that was also part of the property. While living in Preston Township, George W. Adams would be married to Clarissa Hopkins Schaff, and they would eventually raise 5 children in her home. During this time, George would serve time in the Ohio General Assembly, and he would form a stock company in order to build a large suspension bridge over the Muskingum River. Unfortunately, tragedy would strike in the household in 1853 when his wife Clarissa fell ill and passed away. Unfortunately, the family suffered the loss of an infant previously in 1852, and another one of their sons, named Edward Adams, died a few weeks after his mother. Naturally, local legends and ghost stories got involved, and the facts of this incident were distorted to fit a haunting narrative. This story was also presented incorrectly on a few websites that I've seen, and in a previous history guide that was printed under the old Board of Trustees of Prospect Place. The story that was printed claimed that Clarissa had died during childbirth, and her son George died shortly after. The story also claimed that the ghost of Clarissa haunted the family's old home until they eventually moved. As I stated previously, the Adams suffered a loss of an infant previously in 1852. What was his name? You guessed it, George Adams. He was nearly 1 year old. Clarissa died on April 17, 1853, and the son that died shortly after was Edward Adams on May 1, 1853, at the age of 5. This is a perfect example of how the facts of reality can get twisted into an incorrect ghost story or legend. It's unknown what caused Clarissa and Edward's death, but the childbirth narrative seems to be a work of nonsensical ghostly fiction until it can be proven otherwise, or at the minimal, an incorrect retelling of past events. This is just one of many corrections that I would have to make to help restore the history of the family and the estate. A simple trip to the graveyard in Dresden and the website Find a Grave online was all it took for me to disprove this local legend. And I'm not sure why other paranormal research groups couldn't disprove this story over the years. There are many legends about the history of the family and Prospect Place in general, and I think George W. Adams did what any sane individual would have done during his era. He had several kids to raise, and he had to come to terms with the realization that he had to move on. I'm sure that George never fully recovered emotionally from his loss, but I do find it interesting that he did choose to be buried next to Clarissa after his death, even after he had been remarried a few years later. George's second and final marriage would be to a much younger Mary Jane Robinson a few years later. During that time, he decided it was time to move on from the house of sad memories and start work on a new extravagant home closer to Trinway, Ohio for his new bride. George would move his family into a temporary home while the construction began on what is now known as Prospect Place Mansion. The family watched from their temporary home as the mansion was being constructed. I personally believe that George was hoping to move the family into the mansion around the time of his marriage that would become official in October of 1855. However, it wasn't meant to be, as the house caught fire a few months before their marriage, under suspicious circumstances. The surrounding community started looking for somebody to blame for the incident, and some even blamed an elderly Native American woman they referred to as Satan. They claim that she burned it down because the home was built upon a Shawnee burial ground. I'm guessing this was pure speculation from the locals at the time. However, a more logical explanation would eventually present itself, and it was believed that the fire was started by the head bricklayer of the project, George W. Blackburn, and the general belief for the fire was that he wanted to make more work for himself. This shady character helped me unlock and fix many of the legends of the estate that had become local folklore over several generations. I did find it ironic that it had been stated on several of the paranormal shows, including Ghost Adventures and Mysteries at the Castle, that the family was about ready to move into the home when it was burnt to the ground. My first task was to prove that this fire even happened, when it happened, and the details of the event. To this point, there had been no documentation shown to the public to prove that the fire even happened. I found what I was looking for in the form of a newspaper article. The True American newspaper reported the incident on April 24, 1855. Burnt. A new house, unfinished, the property of George Adams near Dresden, Muskingum County, was burnt on the 5th, instant. Loss of $12,000. $1,200 worth of carpentry tools were consumed with the building. I found what I needed. The fire did happen on April 5th, 1855. And contrary to the narrative that the TV networks and shows tried to spin, the family wasn't even close to moving into the home at that time. It's been said the house was valued at close to $50,000 upon its completion, and the recorded loss for this fire was only $12,000. Now I needed to find information on this George W. Blackburn, and to find out why he was a suspect for the arson of the original Prospect Place mansion. Before we start talking about bricklayer George W. Blackburn, I want to make it clear that there's also a lot of misconceptions, legends, and falsehoods about this individual as well. To put it bluntly, George W. Blackburn was one of the most infamous outlaws in Ohio in the 1800s, and he left quite a few long and lengthy paper trails for me to follow, including old newspapers, prison records, and even appeared in a few books and interviews. He was actually used by the prison system in the 1880s as an example of a person that was beyond rehabilitation. His case was even brought up in a fight for making life in prison a reality. He was as bad as they came, and it dumbfounds me how people couldn't find a way to research this man before my findings. The Mysteries at the Castle television show covered the story of Blackburn extremely poorly. During the episode, they made a claim that he was drunk at a local bar and bragged about setting fire to the mansion, and that he was locked up at the Ohio State Penitentiary for the incident. I can say without a shadow of a doubt that this claim was complete and utter nonsense. Blackburn's first conviction at the Ohio Penitentiary was in 1859, 4 years after the fire. This was for an unrelated safe-blowing event 25 miles north of Dresden at a grist mill. Although it has been rumored he bragged about the event, Blackburn never did time for the arson of Prospect Place. He would be released for the first time by Governor David Todd in December of 1863, which means the story that the show aired was complete fiction from that narrative. To make matters even worse, and even more confusing, Several newspapers have also reported another supposed confession from Blackburn in 1866. Blackburn and two cronies attempted to rob a man named Reuben Porter in Morgan County. They broke into Reuben's home, but he heard them making their entrance. Reuben pretended he was asleep, and then he eventually attacked Blackburn with an axe in self-defense, striking him in the arm and leg, and leaving him in an extremely dire condition. Blackburn would hide out in the woods for a few days until officers were eventually able to track him down. Unfortunately, conflicting newspaper reports seemed to be unsure of the victim Reuben Porter's health status after this incident. Blackburn, however, would be taken to the Ohio State Penitentiary's infirmary and nursed back to health. The following is reported by the Columbus Morning Journal on April 3, 1866. And rolling under the bed, he got a hold of an axe with which he attacked Blackburn, striking him upon the thigh and felling him to the floor. He then, by another blow, nearly severed one of the scoundrel's arms and badly injured the other. Blackburn managed to crawl from the house, and by the aid of accomplices, was concealed in an old hut in the woods. He was discovered by the sheriff of Morgan County, who watched and tracked some of Blackburn's friends who were conveying him food and medicines. He is now in the hospital penitentiary under treatment. His wounds are quite severe and will unfit him for work for months to come. Ironically, this would be contrary to what Kathy Baker reported in the June 25, 1967 edition of the Coshocton Tribune, nearly 100 years later. And I quote, "The arsonist was discovered to be a hot-headed bricklayer, George Blackburn, who took to thievery when he decided that bricklaying was too difficult a task. He was apprehended and sent to the Ohio Penitentiary, where he escaped. He was recaptured and later released, when he started robbing again. He met his end when his head was split open with an axe by an intended robbery victim who reported that before Blackburn died, he confessed to the burning of the Adams mansion in order to make more work for himself." Good God. Where do I even begin? That quote was printed as fact nearly 100 years after the incident. The modern equivalent of today's fake news. It makes for one hell of a headline and a story, but it's completely inaccurate and sensationalized. Miss Baker was correct that Blackburn escaped the Ohio State Penitentiary. Twice, in fact. But his first escape came 10 years after the axe incident. Man. The same incident Miss Baker just claimed he died from 10 years prior. Once again, we have ghost stories and legends that have completely ignored or distorted the reality of what actually happened. So for the sake of setting the record straight, I'm going to give you the real history of Prospect Place bricklayer George W. Blackburn, once and for all. My suspicion of Blackburn came from the interviews that were conducted by George Cox in the 1930s. Mr. Cox was a descendant of the Adams family, and he made mentions of Blackburn and his gang causing trouble in the area. He also believed that Blackburn was behind the incident. It's also important to note that George Cox didn't mention that Blackburn did time for the arson, or how he might have met his end. Up to this point, I was only aware of Miss Baker's printed version of events that had been circulating in the community for the last few decades. When I started researching Blackburn, I stumbled upon a newspaper article from the Indianapolis News on April 17, 1896, entitled 30 Years in Prison, Death of Old George Blackburn, a Noted Criminal. I started reading the article in amazement as it detailed Blackburn's extensive criminal history. At first, I wasn't sure it was the same man, but then I seen reference to the axe incident in 1866, and I nearly came out of my seat in excitement. From there, I followed his path of crimes and found other articles related to his crimes, and for the first time, I started connecting the dots, and seeing that the legend that the town and media had made for this man was completely wrong. From there, I started looking for his prison records, and I found them at the Ohio History Center in Columbus, Ohio. I followed his career of crime and started matching up his crimes with the times he was incarcerated. Ironically, his prison records painted the pictures just as I thought it would. The prison log would mention that he was from Dresden, and that he was a bricklayer. The document also gave detailed descriptions of the wounds he received after the axe incident in 1866. I was stunned. How could people misreport this man's story so badly? From everything I was reading, the real story of Blackburn was even crazier than the fake local legends and misreported newspaper articles. Now it was time for me to rewrite his real history, and eventually we would break the news to the mansion's supporters once we fleshed out the details and information on social media. George W. Blackburn was born in Dayton, Ohio in 1820, and from what I've seen, came from a criminal background. He would be married and have children in Dresden, Ohio, and he was a bricklayer by trade. He would end up being sentenced and convicted to the Ohio State Penitentiary several times. The first time occurred in 1859, and the last time would be 1890. During that time, he would be the benefactor of a few early releases, and he is also known to have escaped the prison twice. The first time would be in 1876 as he escaped through the sewer system, and the second time would be in 1895 as a trustee prisoner when he simply walked off the premises at the age of 75. Whoops. As I previously stated, the axe incident did happen and he was critically injured from the encounter, but he didn't die contrary to popular legends and bad reporting. Oddly enough, I also have an interview from Blackburn in 1885 that also talks about these incidents, as well as the prison records to prove he survived the fabled axe incident. I was able to find records of a few of his jail escapes as well. One incident he attempted to tunnel out of a jail in Newark, and in another he shot the Marshal of Dresden in the ear during another jail escape. Blackburn's escapes benefited from his knowledge of masonry. He was also in charge of helping design and construct the new cell block at the Ohio Penitentiary during one of his terms. His most famous escape took place on December 23, 1876 from the Ohio State Penitentiary. He would use his knowledge of a new sewer system that was being installed to help make his escape. Unfortunately for Blackburn, he didn't realize that they had gated his escape drain until the night of the escape. In turn, Blackburn and two accomplices would have to strip themselves of their clothing and pry the metal bars just enough so they could slip out of the grate. Blackburn was the last of the three to escape, and he later said he was stuck in the grating for a considerable amount of time before he was able to squeeze through. During that time, his two fellow escapees bolted and left him to fend for himself. The Cincinnati Enquirer reported the incident on December 24, 1876. Columbus, Ohio, December 23rd. Last night, 3 convicts escaped the Ohio Penitentiary. Chaz Murray, a burglar from Wyandotte County, George Blackburn, a burglar from Perry County, and John Carroll, sent from Cuyahoga County for grand larceny. The men escaped by breaking into and crawling through an unused sewer about 100 yards long. The sewer was so small that in order to crawl through, the men were obliged to remove their clothing. They were aided to escape by outside parties. A reward of $650 is offered for the return of the men. Unfortunately, I was never able to obtain a photo of Mr. Blackburn, and I'm not sure that one even exists. I once seen him noted in a Great Prison Escapes of America article with 6 other convicts. Ironically, the article had 5 of the 6 convicts pictured, and guess who missed picture day? As far as I know, his interment papers never had a mugshot. Unfortunately, the Ohio History Center's records are incomplete for photos, and mugshots really didn't become the norm until around the time of his death. Blackburn's final crime of conviction unfortunately involved the robbery and murder of John Krenn in Hocking County. Blackburn and a few other robbers broke into the man's home and beat him to death in front of his family. During a trial, Blackburn would not admit to striking Krenn, and he was once again locked up for burglary and larceny. One could argue that after 6 convictions and several other scattered arrests over several decades, that he could and should have been executed himself at the prison. However, that wouldn't be the case. Ironically, if he would have been executed, we would have had a photo of him, as the prison normally would sell photos of executed prisoners in the prison's gift shop. Blackburn would make his final escape in 1895 at the age of 75, and he would be arrested shortly after his escape. Ironically, Blackburn died a year before the Ohio State Penitentiary's electric chair came into use in 1897, which we discussed in last month's episode. Kinda ironic how all of these stories kinda come together, isn't it? Blackburn would finally meet his end at the Ohio State Penitentiary on April 14, 1896, and he died due to heart failure. His daughter picked up his body from the prison and had him buried in an unmarked grave in Green Lawn Cemetery in Columbus. I was able to confirm this with not only newspaper records, but also his record of death and his interment card. Oddly enough, he was even buried under a different name. I'm assuming this was for privacy, and also in hopes that the grave wouldn't be desecrated. The interment record, however, confirmed that the grave was indeed Blackburn's. I would later visit his grave and pay my own respects a few weeks later. I'd like to thank Green Lawn Cemetery for helping me confirm my suspicions along the way, and for also helping me put the final nail in the coffin of Blackburn's real story. We may never know the full story of how he was involved with the fire, but as you have heard, he was certainly a prime suspect. That being said, we're going to take a short break and continue our story of Prospect Place Mansion after the break. Hey, you. Have you ever thought about starting your own podcast? I can tell you firsthand that starting a podcast has been a fun and rewarding experience. However, the process can feel overwhelming if you don't know how to get started. That is where Buzzsprout comes in. In fact, it's so good that they've already helped over 100,000 people start their own podcast. Buzzsprout will help you get your podcast onto every major podcasting platform, including Apple iTunes, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and more. You also get a professional website and audio players to share on other websites, detailed analytics, and other tools to help you promote your episodes. Buzzsprout also publishes tutorials, blog posts, and YouTube videos every week to help you get started. To launch your own podcast and to collect your $20 Amazon gift card for signing up, click the link in our show notes on this media player's information panel. This will help support our show, and it will also help Buzzsprout know that we sent you. Buzzsprout, the easiest way to start a podcast. This episode was also brought to you by our good friend Spencer Shepard at B&B Concrete in Shelby, Ohio. He has some amazing stone pieces for your lawn and garden, such as Sasquatches, gargoyles, bird bass, and even dragons. Be the coolest person on your block and visit facebook.com/bnbconcreteman or email bnbconcreteman@gmail.com for more information. Do you like hot sauce? Perhaps it's time to dance with the Reaper. Visit our friends at Spice for Lives Foods on Facebook today. They've recently launched their first hot sauce line called Dance with the Reaper, and they will be debuting their signature taco sauce and Caribbean Rio habanero sauce in the near future. I also hear they're in the process of working on something rather ghostly. Once again, that is Spice for Lives Foods on Facebook. Stop in and visit them today. Alright, welcome back. Now that we've got the details of the fire and George Blackburn out of the way, we're going to focus back on the Adams family and the birth of Prospect Place Mansion. George W. Adams would not be deterred by the original fire, and he immediately ordered the mansion to be rebuilt on the exact same construction site. It's believed that the bricks that could be salvaged from the original fire were used on the carriage house next to the mansion. It's believed that the mansion was officially completed around 1856 or 1857. Descendant George Cox confirmed this when they reset the fireplace mantles in the 1930s. He stated that they found one of Buchanan's presidential slogans written on the back of one of the mantles, and that the slogan itself certainly lined up with the time period in question. It's believed that George W. Adams became involved with the Underground Railroad in the 1840s, and he would eventually become a great abolitionist like his father before him. He would become a conductor, often going himself, and later sending others to retrieve refugee slaves from the South and bring them to freedom in the northern states. Originally, the brothers' grist mill was believed to be the station house, but it's believed that the operation was moved to Prospect Place in the 1850s as a looming threat of civil war was starting to become a reality. This would ensure that the brothers' business wouldn't be endangered, and that the operation could continue with more secrecy. During my research, I was able to find a newspaper article advertising an anti-slavery convention George W. Adams spoke at in 1844 in Leesburg, Ohio, now Leesville, Ohio. I was also able to confirm this through multiple sources in Leesville. Anti-Slavery Convention. There will be an anti-slavery convention held in the town of Leesburg, Carroll County, Ohio, commencing on Tuesday, March 26, 1844, to continue for 2 or more days. President Nevin of Franklin College, New Athens, Mr. Urquhart of Cadiz, and several other able advocates of human rights will be in attendance to address the people. A.R. Dempster, George W. Adams, U.C. McCoy, and Jacob Millisack. Leesburg, March 6, 1844. I find it ironic that George Adams knew Jacob Millisack, as Millisack is also known for making his house a station house on the Underground Railroad as well. And ironically, his house was literally right next to the railroad line that George Adams was a conductor of. One could speculate that Adams possibly incorporated the railroad itself into his Underground Railroad operation. However, there is no additional information to confirm this at this time. While some Underground Railroad houses were equipped with a tunnel system, it appears that Prospect Place was not one of them. The nonprofit organization's efforts haven't uncovered any evidence of a tunnel system at this time. However, I do find it ironic that a few old newspapers reference tunnels that were supposedly filled in, but I'm not sure if there is any truth to those statements, or if the claims were used to help pad some of the legend articles they were notorious for publishing around that time. The term Underground Railroad was created just to reference the clandestine activity itself. I'm certainly open-minded to the idea of a tunnel system, but further proof would need to be presented to support that claim. George W. Adams was an interesting man, and I was able to pull a lot of new information about him through my research as well. Despite the local reporting over the years, we have discovered he owned multiple grist mills. Not only did he have 2 in what later became Adams Mills, Ohio, he also had one right across from the mansion itself. And God knows how many other operations he had going across the state. He is one of the largest landowners in the state of Ohio, and he was always trying to find new ways to add to his fortune. George was also a prominent farmer. One newspaper, the Belmont Chronicle, had reported that he owned around 13,000 sheep in 1871. Mr. Adams was also the intended robbery victim of a botched train robbery in 1859. However, he was late that day and he had to board the next train. Ironically, the folks that were trying to rob him were on time and they missed each other. George Adams would eventually become more involved with the railroad system before his death. He became the director of the Steubenville and Indiana Railroad, and he was the owner and director of the Cincinnati and Muskingum Valley Railroad. George would pass away, presumably in the house, in 1879, and he left his entire estate to Mary and their 7 children. It's been claimed in the past that his estate was worth $14 million at the time of his death. However, I haven't seen any documentation to support that claim. Ironically, after his death, the family couldn't find George's important financial documents that the family would require for their inheritance. I'm just going to read the following newspaper article I found related to this incident. It was amusing and yet disturbing at the same time. From the Cincinnati Enquirer, September 15, 1879. House of missing papers were found, Zanesville, September 14th. Some valuable papers belonging to the estate of the late George Adams, a wealthy gentleman residing near Dresden who died several weeks ago, could not be found. It being known that such papers did exist, and the perplexing question of what became of them, was seemingly a hard one to solve. Some members of the family remembered Mr. Adams was buried in a suit of clothes that he wore on his last visit he made to Zanesville. Yesterday his grave was opened by his friends, and the papers with other very valuable documents were found in the side pocket of his coat. And they say you can't take money to the grave with you. Well, that concludes this month's episode of the C-Bus Paranormal Paracast. I hope that everybody's enjoyed learning more about the early beginnings of Prospect Place Mansion. Next month, we're going to start digging into Anna Adams' era with the mansion, its eventual fall from grace, and its rebirth. I'm also going to be taking a special look at the reported hauntings of the mansion, and discuss even more paranormal television shows' inaccuracies and outright lies about the property. Yep, there's more, and it gets even more ridiculous. Please feel free to submit your questions about the mansion to us on social media or email our account at cbusparanormal@hotmail.com. As always, please remember to subscribe to the C-Bus Paranormal Paracast on your favorite podcasting platforms and add us to your social media accounts for the latest C-Bus Paranormal news and updates. Once again, thank you for the support, everyone, and thank you for listening. Would you like to meet our team in person? Join us on August 13th, 2022 from 11 a.m. to 5 p.m. at the West Virginia Penitentiary Paracon. This event is going to be held at the West Virginia Penitentiary in Moundsville, West Virginia, which is an awesome location. There will also be some special events afterwards that are still to be announced. Please visit wvpentours.com for more information.